Okay guys, we're faced with a challenge. How are we going to make movies during a pandemic? Access to gear is limited, but there's one thing that we all have, and that's a phone. Mine's a bit dirty. But movies have been shot on phones before. Why can't we do it? So what this video is going to be about for you is we're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the camera on a phone, and this applies to any phone, not just an iPhone. Famously, people like to talk about iPhone movies, but that shouldn't be a limitation. Should be able to use any device if you understand its weaknesses and you understand its strengths. So we're going to look at what the strengths are and what the weaknesses are, so we can play away from the weaknesses and play towards the strengths. Next, we're going to find good examples of movies that have been shot on iPhones, and we're going to reverse engineer them to see how they got the images that they got out of a phone. Thirdly, we're going to ask for advice. We're going to turn to people who have been in this situation before, who have done amazing work shooting on a phone. We're going to ask them what they learned in that process and what they can tell us going into it ourselves. First, let's start with the strengths and weaknesses, the pros and cons of shooting on a smartphone. Because phones are designed to be small and flat and fit in your pocket, they also contain a small camera sensor. That sensor is comprised of an array of photosites. Those photosites allow light to be turned into digital signals to produce an image. Because of the small surface area of the sensor, only a limited number of photosites can be placed into an array. That technology is constantly improving, but there comes a point where the way light behaves and the physics of light won't allow for a better image on a small sensor. That small sensor is also responsible for why a camera phone cannot have a shallow depth of field, which allows for those buttery soft backgrounds that create separation between the character and the environment that they're in. So when you're composing your shots, you need to take into consideration that many elements are going to be in focus, both in the foreground, midground, and background of your shot. The less photosites a sensor can have, the less dynamic range it will have as well, so there's less latitude in color grading, and when you're shooting you need to consider that your highlights will blow out sooner, and you'll need to light in a way that will preserve the details in your shadows. Small sensors are prone to digital noise, and because of their restricted surface area can't gather a lot of information in poor light conditions. When shooting an image on a smartphone, it would be a good idea to find a location where you have control over the light, or an exterior location with an abundance of light. Because smartphone cameras are designed for ease of use, they also have a lot of automatic settings that can't be turned off. In filmmaking, we want the maximum control over our camera so that we can make creative decisions that helps us tell the story, and this is why it's necessary to have a third-party app like Filmmaking Pro that allows you to lock in your exposure, focus, and shutter speed, including your ISO and many other manual settings that cinematographers need to take control over their image. In the past few years, cell phone manufacturers have been introducing different focal lengths into their camera systems, but the majority of cell phones still have one fixed wide lens, and this has a massive impact on your compositional choices. Having only a wide lens makes it more challenging to get traditional shot sizes. Because the smartphone is so small and light, it also picks up every slight vibration from your hands or body movement. This is seldom noticeable when you play it back on the cell phone screen, but becomes very evident when you blow it up and watch it on a bigger screen. To make your images look more professional, rather lock the phone down on a tripod and try to use pans or use a gimbal to help smooth out the movement. A big factor to consider is that smartphone imaging is very dependent on post-processing. You might have even noticed a big quality difference between the photo and video modes on your own phone. You can consider a smartphone image to be a best guess, as the software and algorithms try to compensate for the small sensor size. This means that post-processing issues like denoising and over-sharpening are all baked into the image. Being aware of this allows you to look out for it and compensate during a day's shoot, and even learn methods to try and avoid evoking this post-processing to happen in camera. Shooting on a smartphone does come with some advantages over more traditional ways of shooting. The speed of use being a massive advantage for filmmakers, the time between camera setups can be drastically cut short, allowing for the energy on set to remain high and dynamic. Because smartphones are designed to be easy to use, This removes the technical barrier and shortens the learning curve of picking up and starting to film. Because of the small form factor of the phone, it can also be less invasive and also might allow for more natural performances. Most people are quite used to being filmed on a cell phone. This small size also makes a smartphone camera quite versatile, and it can fit into many small nooks and crannies where conventional or bigger cameras cannot, making it much easier to shoot in small locations like a car. Smartphone filmmaking is also generally more affordable. Even entry-level and mid-range phones have quite decent cameras built into them. Data management is usually streamlined with many options to share and move the data between devices, and the phone camera usually uses a lower bitrate, allowing for smaller file sizes, which are easy to edit in post-production. This being said, make sure you have enough free space on your phone to last you for at least a shoot day. Also put your phone on flight mode or remove the SIM card altogether to make sure there's no interruptions while you're shooting and that recording doesn't stop by accident. Another thing to consider is the familiarity with the aesthetic of cell phone footage. Certain stories can benefit from the mood and tone that this creates. A film that takes advantage of this familiar aesthetic to its benefit is Steven Soderberg's 2018 film Unsane. We're going to be having a look at that film, and then we're going to look at his second iPhone attempt, High Flying Bird. The first thing that gives Unsane away is the use of the phone's native aspect ratio, which is immediately noticeable if you're used to watching movies in more popular cinematic aspect ratios. This aspect ratio combined with the phone's wide lens causes awkward framing at times. The limited data rate of the phone causes artifacting in the blacks. If you look very closely, you can also see some denoising that has happened that has caused the colors to sort of smudge together. Just cast your eyes over to the bartender. Because of the limited dynamic range that a small sensor offers, the highlights tend to bloom out or lose information in the highlights altogether. This limited dynamic range is also the reason why in exteriors the roll-off is so harsh and the image looks so high contrast. Smartphone video is also very dependent on post-processing that happens inside the phone that causes a lot of sharpening. So you'll see in an image it doesn't look very naturalistic because of the massive amount of sharpening that happens. Stabilization is also another issue that introduces jitter and anti-aliasing issues. Soderbergh's second iPhone feature, High Flying Bird, isn't free of these technical issues. In the shot alone, we can see evidence of anti-aliasing, jitter, moire, and focus breathing. One technical issue that haunts this film is even though Soderbergh used Filmic Pro to override the automatic nature of the phone and give him the ability to lock in focus, ISO, and shutter speed, you can still see the camera's image sensor adjust mid-shot, especially when there's a change of light due to blocking because a character needs to move past the window, or when the camera is panning across a bright light source. What makes this even more tricky is the fact that it's not the entire frame that responds to the adjustment, but only pieces of the frame. For example, you might find parts of the image shaking. In certain cases where it's really extreme, fixing it could take hours to days in post-production, which ultimately defeats the point of a speedy workflow. The biggest difference between Unsane and High Flying Bird is that Soderbergh has learned from his first attempt, and in his second iPhone film rarely takes into consideration the limitations of the iPhone. In this film, he doesn't try and make the camera do things it wasn't designed to do. The majority of scenes are shot in locations with an abundance of light. They're either exteriors or they're shot in rooms with large windows. This helps to downplay the camera's weakness in low light. Soderbergh chooses shot types that don't depend on shallow depth of field, rack focus, or any of those conventional visual storytelling methods you would have on a larger frame sensor camera. When it comes to movement, the shots are always locked off on a tripod using only a pan, or they're stabilized on a motorized gimbal. This allows the filmmaker not to depend on stabilization in post-production, which helps minimize the occurrence of artifacts in the image. Soderbergh also takes advantage of clever compositional choices that can only be achieved by having a small phone that you can place anywhere. These choices are always linked to story and they are highly effective. For example, the many scenes that take place in a car feel very voyeuristic and almost as if you were there. Many of you joined us when we had that awesome 3-hour discussion with Lawrence Sher. We're going to talk about some of the advice he gave us for shooting on a smartphone. He says that the beauty of the wide lens is that it's quite dynamic, and he points to the work of Emmanuel Lubezki, who in his last few films like The Revenant and Birdman has really embraced the wide lens and turned shooting wide into his signature style. He also shoots with a deep depth of field. So in a weird way, you can turn to Lubezki and what he's been doing, and you could think to yourself that that's almost no different than what you could be achieving on a smartphone, be it iPhone or Android. Lawrence spoke about embracing the limitations of the device you're shooting on. He said when he shot the short film Daughter that he did for Apple, that when he got the phone, the first thing he did is he went out and he tested it and tried to push it to its limit, try and break it to see where the limitations of the device are, so that he knew to work inside those boundaries. One of the discoveries he made was that the way the phone changes exposure on a bright day is by ramping up the shutter speed. That shutter can go up to something ridiculous like 1/5000th of a second, so suddenly everything in the image looks incredibly sharp. Knowing that, we want to get the shutter speed down to 50 so we can mimic the cinematic motion blur we're all used to. And to do that, you need to put a crap load of ND in front of the lens. By doing that, we remove one of the biggest giveaways that indicates to the viewer that we're shooting on a phone. He also mentions the relative ISO of a phone, and that it would be better to lock it down between the 100 to 300 range, 100 being the optimal. Once the phone moves over 300, the image tends to get really noisy. The iPhone 11 that Lawrence shot Daughter on has a 1.8 lens, so it's a really fast lens. So if you can shoot in a scene that provides you the optimal amount of light for the 100 to 300 ISO range, your images can look quite striking and you can take real advantage of that color depth. In those optimal conditions, the phone image can look really great, but you can also flood the camera with light and create these really high contrast images. If you can keep your limitation of 100 ISO and you keep lighting till that looks good, the blacks that might show up because you're exposing down might be very rich. Lawrence also hints that you could shoot through a lot of things, and by having elements in the foreground, you can trick the human eye into thinking there's less depth of field than there actually is. Ultimately, shooting on a smartphone should be seen as a cool experiment inside a limitation, and I hope this video gave you all the tools you need to go out and create great images on the phone in your pocket.